Hello, and welcome to our segment on beneficial ownership reporting. My name is Hopeton Lindo, Client Relationship Manager for AxiomSL, covering asset managers in North America. And today, I'm speaking with my colleague and friend, Gaurav Chandra, who is Global Product Manager responsible for the development of our beneficial ownership reporting platform, something that we call GSD. So for those that are not familiar with AxiomSL, we are a risk and regulatory reporting software platform that principally serves four groups: banks, broker-dealers, commodity trading, and investment managers. So that will include 40 Act funds and those in the alternative space. So what sets us apart from other service providers in this space? Well, for one, we have a proprietary data management layer that lies at the heart of all of the reporting modules that are featured in the platform. And this gives our clients powerful upstream data manipulation tools. And then number two, we have a unified platform that allows the clients that I've mentioned earlier to run all of their reporting from a single unified platform. So today we're focused on beneficial ownership reporting. And I'd like to ask you, Gaurav, what are the themes associated with beneficial ownership reporting? And what are some of the current challenges faced by the firms that you're interacting with?
Hi, Upton. Firstly, thank you for the introduction and hello to all of viewers out there. And coming to your question itself, I think there are sort of three broad themes. Number one, the rules themselves. Number two, the data associated with this, both market data and sort of the position data. And number three is the convergence of the rules and the data sets themselves. I'm going to sort of talk about each one of these in detail. So if you look at this from a rules perspective, so the COVID-19 disaster sort of been impacting every one of us in sort of a personal capacity in some shape or form, and beneficial ownership reporting is no exception to that. We've seen a lot of the rules which have changed because of this directly. In the case of EU short selling threshold changes, for example, or indirectly in the shape of M&A activity which is sort of taking place, and also a lot of sensitive industry rules which have been tweaked over the last 6 months or so. So the rules are definitely one of the constant changes which impact anyone in this in this field.
Mm-hmm.
And the key for us here is essentially the flexibility to respond and the flexibility to customize, because these changes come thick and fast, and you need to be able to adapt both in terms of speed and accuracy. And that's not always the easiest thing to do, especially from a rules perspective.
Mm-hmm.
The second theme I mentioned was around data. Now, data is a very broad topic to talk about, but the themes are sort of, the underlying themes are standard, so to speak, right? So you've got your sourcing of data from multiple disparate sources upstream. You got to figure out a way to harmonize this data in some shape or form. You could have challenges with your market data. Maybe you have multiple sources of market data where you're sourcing this data from. Could be Refinitiv, Bloomberg, ICE, or other sources, and you're sort of consolidating all of that. So that sort of getting that right, getting that story right is important. And there could genuinely be gaps in the data. Maybe your transactions and your positions don't reconcile for whatever reason, and that has an impact on what you monitor and eventually report.
Right.
And last but not least, I think the operating model challenges are one of the biggest items that I've seen in my interactions with clients. And when we say operating model, what we really mean is how often are these positions sort of getting fed into the system? How often are we executing them? How often are we doing our monitoring checks? Because in a sort of a big buy-side firm which is constantly trading, there's multiple position feeds coming in Asia, in Europe, in Americas, and sort of getting that rolling is always important. And that's sort of where we can really help. So that, I think all of these combine to form the second theme, which is data. And the third theme, which I think is personally very close to my heart, is about a forced decoupling of data management and rules management. Because what you tend to see, Hopeton, is that the rules and the compliance, the rules are sort of maintained by the compliance teams,
Right.
and the data side of things are taken care of by the IT or ops. And there's this sort of siloed vision, and no one's sort of looking at it holistically, either by design or otherwise. And that's where we firmly believe having a data management platform at the helm helps you address your data challenges. So you bring in your data in native format and sort of tweak it, do whatever you need to do with it to get that rolling. And then a rules engine, which is built on top of that, is the best way to stop this forced decoupling of data management and rules management. So those are the three themes which I think are very near and dear to anyone who's involved in this area.
Okay, great. Thanks for that explanation. So, we've addressed some of the major inputs, but I'd like to also talk about some of the market forces that are impacting asset managers currently, one of which is mergers and acquisitions. And we've seen recently with the acquisition of Legg Mason by Franklin Templeton. I want you to talk, if you can, a little bit about the impact of those types of acquisitions on reporting, on subsidiaries and parent companies. And obviously that's also going to have an impact on entity structure and complexity of entity structure. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I think, again, the sort of M&A activities and any changes of this sort, they impact investors in two primary ways. One is from a data perspective, which is kind of obvious because you're onboarding or offboarding a bunch of different entities, either new or existing, and that's going to have an impact on your hierarchy and the way you aggregate and disaggregate. But getting the data itself is a challenge, and they'll all potentially be in different formats and different sort of shapes. You got to be able to you have to be able to make sure that your position data from different systems and for your affiliates is sort of harmonized in some shape or form, right? So that's challenge number one. And challenge number two is to then take that data and then be able to make sure that the rules are applied accurately. So again, an example of this could be in countries in the EU, for example. The requirement is for your beneficial ownership monitoring rules, or your long or short position monitoring rules. The fund manager has the discretion to independently monitor their holdings compared to anyone where the fund manager rolls up to, let's say, an entity hierarchy and eventually to a group. So you got to be able to disaggregate these holdings on the fly for these individual fund managers in certain countries, whereas in other countries, the group has the obligation to aggregate and roll up all these entities at a group level and then monitor and find out if you have any percentage movements. So the entity aggregation and disaggregation is a key component in sort of these M&A activities. And if you don't have the flexibility of being able to handle this or address this, either from a rules perspective or a data perspective, then it's going to be tough going.
Right. So I'm thinking, not to interrupt, but I'm thinking, there are firms out there that, they're in 60, 70 plus different jurisdictions. Each of those jurisdictions will have different rules around how you aggregate and disaggregate your holdings. How do you, keep track of all of that and stay compliant?
So to answer that question, actually, it's interesting. So technically, an investment manager doesn't have to be in 60, 70 different locations to even worry about these things. Like, they could be in a single location, but they could be investing everywhere in the world, right? And you could still be exposed to all these different regulations. So just because you're located in a country doesn't mean you have to follow the rules of that country. Right? It's a common misconception, but I'm glad you sort of brought that up. But going back to your original question, aggregation and disaggregation is one of the biggest challenges clients have today, because the rules are open to sort of interpretation as well in certain cases. Like, it's not necessarily prescriptive. So we have different clients sort of taking their own stance, saying even if the fund managers have the discretion to monitor, the group is monitoring on their behalf, because the fund managers can delegate that responsibility to their group if they want to. They can disaggregate if they want to, but they can also roll it up to their group and let the group aggregate all the holdings. So that's a discretion, and that is available to these managers. Having said that, any holdings or any movements still have to be monitored at that level. So that is important. So just because the obligation to report is delegated doesn't mean the obligation to monitor can be delegated. That has to be done at a fund manager level. And that differentiation is important.
Right. No, and what you're saying is resonating. I'm thinking about the clients that we interact with that have the multi-affiliate model. And there are a fair few investment managers that, have that type of structure that, face those issues. So thanks for that. So, we've been speaking about equity monitoring across, the globe, and, something that's covered less extensively, I think, is the monitoring of restricted industries. We obviously call that sensitive industry monitoring internally. And, the types of industries that we're talking about here are banking and insurance, telecoms, gaming, and media, to name a few. So we treat that slightly differently to equity monitoring. And I wonder if you could, explain the complexity around this space and some of the misconceptions that we see in the market.
Sure, and I think that's a very important point, especially in this current climate, where there's been a flurry of changes in sensitive industries in particular. So I think the challenge with sensitive industries is sort of, again, twofold. One, the primary challenge, in my opinion anyway, is to do with the industry classifications. Unfortunately or fortunately, there is no sort of global industry classification which is sort of universally accepted. There's a fair few floating around. There's NACE code, NAICS code, there's GICS codes, or GICS codes as we call it. There's TRBC codes from Thomson Reuters, and there's Bloomberg Industry Classification Code. So there's like a broad variety of different industry classifications out there without necessarily any harmonization between them, right? So now the biggest challenge we have is, let's say we stick with one standard. Let's say we take GICS as the sole driver of industry classification. Now, the problem that we see is the parent company, the group company. So let's take Harley-Davidson as an example, right? So on the face of it, Harley-Davidson would be classified as an automotive firm, and they'll have their corresponding GICS code or TRBC code or whatever else it is that you sort of end up using as your industry classifier, right? So Harley-Davidson would get treated under automobiles or automotive rules. That's fine. However, under Harley-Davidson, there's one of their affiliates or entities, which is the Harley-Davidson Financial Services entity, which is like a legal, it is an LEI. There is physically no way for anyone to invest in that unless, I guess, there's physically no way to invest in that. You can only trade in the securities of Harley-Davidson, the group, right? So we know that Harley-Davidson Financial Services, in certain cases, does get processed under the US banking rules, right? So if you were to use GICS as your sole driver for sensitive industries, you will not be able to process Harley-Davidson under the US banking rules, because the GICS code will say, well, guess what? It's automobiles, nothing to do with banking. So that's how it's going to get processed.
Right.
So that's sort of one of the misconceptions, I think, which some firms out there have. And we just want to make sure that people understand that there's more depth to it than just GICS code. And sort of making sure that you go through the hierarchy of the firm in question and understand whether there's other industries that can potentially also be a part of that particular firm when you invest in that firm, and they can be at play. So something to keep in mind. And so that's sort of challenge number one. The other challenge with sensitive industries is with the rules and the products that are the financial instruments that are processed, because sensitive industries as a theme is so broad. Because if you look at long and short position monitoring, the sort of uniform rules and regs for it. There's sort of one regulator, if you may, but if you start looking at sensitive industries, there's individual regulators for energy firms, for automobile firms, and so on and so forth, and banking firms as well, right? And it sort of gets into a lot of different regs, which are not always prescriptive. And that opens up interpretations of what is in scope, what is not in scope. Do you have exemptions? Are there any capacity exemptions? And so on and so forth. So again, it is our firm belief that flexibility is the key to make sure that you have some flexibility for your sensitive industry rules, instead of taking a one size fits all approach, because we know that is just not going to work. Because there's a lot of baked in assumptions when service providers out there are offering their sensitive industry modules. And this is something we pride ourselves on the fact that we have an out of the box offering, but we give the flexibility to the clients to tweak the rules based on how they see fit. And I'm very happy to announce as well that, our latest and greatest sensitive industries product will be launching fairly soon, before the end of October 2020. And some of the points we discussed earlier will be addressed in that. So, talk to us to find out more.
Okay, great. Thanks for that commentary. And so I'd just like to wrap up today by just summarizing what we've discussed. So first of all, we started off by talking about global shareholding disclosure. In particular, we spoke about the rules and the importance of the flexibility around interpretation and custom rule building. We addressed data integrity and the importance of the closer integration of these two elements. We also spoke about aggregation and disaggregation across increasingly complex entity structures, and having a platform that can handle the entity depth that we see in a lot of investment managers. And finally, we spoke about sensitive industries, and you spoke at length about the nuance that's involved around monitoring and the complexity that is involved when you're classifying your holdings. And of course, the interpretation of the rules across multiple regulators and also states here in the United States. So here at AxiomSL, we believe that we are uniquely positioned to address all of these issues with our data management layer that houses our full suite of reporting tools, again, on one unified platform. And it gives our clients, as you've mentioned, Gaurav, the flexibility to consolidate their reporting onto this single platform. And then, if you're able to do that, you can take advantage of the data synergies that exist between forms, and also leverage the flexibility of creating rules on the fly to cover some very specific product types that may not be covered by the regulators. We of course do this for both 40 Act funds and those in the alternative space. So if you're one of these firms that are grappling with any of these issues we have spoken about today, we would love to be in touch to continue the conversation. Many thanks for your time today.
Thank you.